So the first words I heard this morning when I walked in, I park at the school and I walk over and I kind of take in the church. I get myself psyched up for the day. Also trying to save space for folks when we have an overwhelming group of people who come for worship. So I just go over there and I'm on my way over this morning. I'm thinking and I'm looking for trash so I can pick up on the way. And then I walk through the door and nearly every Sunday, the first person or people I see are Doc and Pam. Doc and Pam. Now I see Doc. And Doc's usually dressed real nice. He's got usually has a jacket on and matches his shoes, or at least his socks. And style, all about style. Pam, Pam's just wonderful and beautiful in all ways, and doesn't really matter what outfit she's chosen, we all know that she's gonna be delightful. Me, on the other hand, I wear jeans, and I did get some new shoes. Jeans, and I'm just a simple guy. But the first words I heard today, Pastor, nice shirt. It is, huh? It's kind of a nice shirt. I was excited to wear it today. I actually ironed it last night. I do the ironing in my home. And I ironed this one and another one just so I'd have options. Normally, I get up and whatever's clean and doesn't have a lot of wrinkles, I throw that baby on. And you probably recognize that on Sunday mornings. But this is a very nice shirt. And I would like to tell you where you could go get it. But honestly, I don't know if there are any more of these. Because I got mine, it's one of a kind. I got mine from Goodwill. And at Goodwill, there's not like extras of everything. So this was a $5.99 special. Eventually I'll be done with it. I'll give it back to Goodwill and maybe then you can purchase it for yourself. It's a very nice shirt if you're into that kind of shopping. It's great. This one was the Goodwill over on 105, on the east side of 105 in Conroe. It's a great little store. They got some good choices. I grabbed 3 that day, actually. So here's the thing. I care about how I look. I do, probably more than I should. I'm bald today because I got tired of the vanity that came along with making sure that my bald spots weren't showing. So I just decided to shave it all off, and then there's no more bald spots. I can wear a hat now and take it off, and my hair's not messed up, and I don't have to worry about if it's showing the parts of where my forehead was creeping back towards the back of my head. I care about how I look. I stand in front of mirrors sometimes longer than I should. Sometimes when I get dressed, I'll take a look, and if I'm still wondering if what I'm wearing is good enough, and my wife is there, I'll walk out and ask her, hey, what do you think? If we're going somewhere together, sometimes I let her get dressed first so I can see what color she's wearing and I can try to match her. Sorry, I'm that dude. It's been known for me to get dressed, ready to walk out the door, and then I look at myself as I'm going out the door and go, I don't want to wear this. And I'll run right back to the closet. They're all in the car, and I change again. Because I care about how I look. This morning, my wife was awake as I was getting ready to leave for here. And I had this sleeve like this, and I had this sleeve like this. And I went and stood in front of her. I said, hey, babe, what do you think? She goes, I think the shirt looks great. I said, no. 2 folds or 3. She says, 3. And so I rolled this one back up to 3, which I was really glad she chose because if I'd unfolded this one, it would have been extra wrinkles. Right? Again, I care about how I look. The things we wear, our dressing matters, but not in the way that I've led you to believe. This imagery, this metaphor of getting dressed, putting on, was the metaphor that Paul is using in this portion of the letter to the church in Colossae. For those of you who have been with us in the series, we're doing this series called The Domino Effect, and we're walking through the entire book of Colossians. It's this letter that Paul writes to a church. It's a young church. It's a church that he's never actually been to physically face-to-face. He knows some of their people, but he's in prison writing a letter to this church, trying to encourage them in their early days. Hey, don't get caught off and hung up in the false teachings of that community, of the pagan culture around you. Don't get sidetracked. Make sure that you're following along what I taught you, the things about Jesus. And so he's writing this letter, and he gets to the 3rd chapter, and this is where we are. We've gone through the first 2. The general idea of this effect being that Jesus tipped the first domino into the earliest believers, into the next set, to the next set, to the next set. And eventually it gets to us, and we are a domino waiting to be tipped. And we, like the dominoes before us, can tip incrementally and exponentially, more than just our faith to 1, but our faith can literally impact 2.5 times us if you follow this visual. So living the faith, revealing the faith, modeling the faith, for the people around you to see is super important. And Paul calls this out to us in this 3rd chapter of Colossians. I'm going to read just a handful of the verses, and then I'm going to break into what it had to say to me. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. He continues. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace, and be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms and hymns and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Now, again, Paul is talking to believers. This letter was written to a church. And so much of what the word said to me this week was directed towards people who have said yes to Jesus. And so because I believe that most of us in the room have at one point in our life or another said yes to Jesus, some of us didn't wake up this morning reminding ourselves that we've said such. Some of us came this morning to be reminded that at one point we did say such, and maybe today's instruction will help us live a life that says such. I also know that there are some in the room who are still trying to figure this thing out, and is he really worth saying yes to? And my contention is that for those in the room and those watching online and those in the world around us that are still wondering and watching and waiting, it's because they're waiting and wondering and watching us and trying to determine if what they see is the kind of life that they want for themselves. They're watching to see if the life that we live looks all that different than the life they live. I mean, truly, if they can live their life and we can live ours, and the only difference is we said yes to Jesus, but we still get to party the way we did before we said yes to Jesus. We still get to clothe ourselves with things other than this, just the way we did before we said yes to Jesus. We get to hold grudges against other people, just like people who don't say yes to Jesus. Then why would I say yes to Jesus if nothing really has to change? But before you get hung up in, or before I get hung up in this following Jesus being some sort of a moralistic, therapeutic deism, meaning you just act right, feel good, and believe that there's a God, being a Christian is pretty easy, but following Jesus, we all know, is not. And so the encouragement today is, how can we, as people who say we follow Jesus, reveal this in the world around us? And this is what Paul's trying to get at. In the stuff that Dr. Rob talked about this past week, he was talking about the undressing portion. And for fun, I asked some of the other pastors, hey, would it be off-putting if I started to undress as I talked about that part and then dress back with this new part? And they said that would be a bad illustration, go south in a hurry. So we're not going to literally undress or dress here in the message, but I do want to begin here. In this very first verse, therefore as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, Paul makes a few statements about who we are before we get clothed, before we get all dressed up. And before we start talking about getting dressed and what we're dressing up in, it is important. It was important to Paul, and it's important to me for you to know who you are before you get dressed, figuratively speaking. He says that we are God's chosen people. Now, they hear that and they think people of Israel are, in fact, God's chosen people. God was with them when they were in slavery. He came to them. He got them out of slavery. He walked with them through a lot of difficult experiences, got them to a promised land because his people had been promised this land. And so these people knew from the get that if God made me and I'm a part of this Israel community, I am one of God's chosen. And so Paul reminds them of that. You are God's chosen people. And then he says, you're holy. Some of this is a reminder to them, remember, you're holy, but it's also a declaration to them, remember, you are holy. Now, what he probably means here in this holiness, kind of our language, churchy language, would be justified and sanctified. which again is kind of churchy, so let me break it down even more. So being holy meant to be set apart. And in the Christian world, the way that we are set apart, again, isn't by our doing, but by the work of God through the person of Jesus. And we're set apart, made holy because of his righteousness, we become righteous. And so there's these two churchy words, justification, sanctification. They're like this. Justification was that moment when God said, yes, you're my child. And it's a little different than saying, I created you and my fingerprints are on you. There's a moment when we say, I love you, I want you in my life, I receive what you did in the person of Jesus. And then at that point, God says, not only do you have my fingerprints on you, not only did I create you in my image, but I now call you my child. It's an important nuance, but it's important to note. We become children of God when we claim a part of the family that God has made us available to and invited us into. So that's what justification is. He said yes to us, we said yes back, and here we are in the family. But the Bible also teaches that once we say yes to the yes that's been spoken to us, we're now in family relationship. And what God will do from that point forward is set us apart more and more each day. As we lean into his love, as we lean into his teachings, we're going to find ourselves becoming more and more like the person of Jesus. And that's kind of the goal. But again, it's not the goal being that I try harder by doing and saying, but I receive what God has done for me more and more each day. I welcome the fruit of the Spirit that God has placed within me, and I make it more tangible in the outward-facing view of my life. So it's not getting hung up in doing the right things. Anyway, then he says, you're holy, you're dearly loved. And for me, this is like the core of the whole deal. It's the Matthew 3:16, 17, where Jesus comes out of the water and God speaks over him at his baptism. You are my child, my beloved, with you I'm well pleased. Now, Paul would pick up on this theme later in Romans and say, when we cry out to God as Abba, as Father, we become heirs of God, meaning God gives us stuff as our Father. We are heirs. But then Paul goes on to say we are co-heirs with Christ. And so whatever my take is that whatever God has given to Jesus, if I'm his co-heir, then he's giving it to me too. And if he says of Jesus, you are my child, my beloved, with you I'm well pleased, then I believe by Scripture that I am also hearing and should hear the words from God saying, you are my child, my beloved, and with you I'm well pleased. And Paul is just echoing this again as he's getting into this portion of this third chapter. We are both chosen, holy, and dearly loved. And then he goes into clothe yourselves. What we wear matters. And he talks about how we should clothe ourselves, what we should clothe ourselves with. Clothe ourselves with. He has a list of them here. He has compassion. You know, compassion is feeling the pain of another. Not immediately going to my own pain and pointing a finger at the person who caused it, but compassion. I wonder why they're in pain, and I wonder why hurt people, and they hurt me, but I wonder what's hurting them. It's a second level. It requires a little bit more than just an instinctual response. He says, clothe yourselves with compassion. He says, clothe yourself with kindness. Kindness, we talk about that in our benediction, right? Remember to be kind and gentle. Kind's the very first thing. Because we don't know the burdens that others bear, so be kind to them. Take a little extra lap in your own mind before you decide to be ugly. Just be kind. He says, clothe yourselves with humility. Again, some smart person said humility is not thinking less of yourself or demeaning yourself or saying you're dirt and you're no good. That's false humility. That's pretending you don't have value, and God's not very pleased with that because God's placed value in you already. But humility is thinking of yourself less. Humility is thinking of others first. Humility is being willing to be last so that others can be first. Humility is about not needing to be the person in the room that everyone's looking at and celebrating and applauding. Humility is about looking for someone else in the room that you can deflect and direct the praise to. And in Christian community, humility is ultimately about pointing to the one who makes us valuable. It's remembering some other words of Paul where he says, it's not I who live, but Christ who lives within me. I like to say it a little differently. When people have an affirmation or a confirmation of my giftings, the truth of the matter is, it's not I who live. It's Christ who lives within me. And I do get to bring forth who Christ is in a public way. And sometimes I do it better than I do at other times. And so I appreciate and I receive the affirmation. But at the end of the day, I'm no good without him in me. And neither are you. You're no good without him in you. He says to clothe ourselves with gentleness, kind and gentle. It's the second word of our benediction. We say it every single week, to be gentle, not heavy-handed, not coercive. You think about the kinds of conversations that we have with one another, especially when we get into topics where there's a quick divide of whose team are you on. Imagine if those conversations were grounded in gentleness rather than abrasive and abrupt, and if I get louder, I win. But gentleness. Holding someone gently. Holding what their views are gently, so that you can value the person who's espousing them. And then finally, he says, clothe yourselves with patience. Now, patience isn't just, hey, I'm in a hurry to get things done. I wish that stoplight would turn green so I can get to my next thing. That's not the patience he's talking about. He's talking about patience in more of the long suffering. Like when you would hear the psalmist say, how long, O Lord? Long suffering. How long must I? It's that patience. Clothe yourself with patience, which kind of has a cousin of faith and confidence that God is doing something. We sing a song sometimes that says, even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. In the Black church, the statement that I hear oftentimes is, God's never late. He always shows up on time. That's the kind of patience, long suffering that Paul's getting at. But then he gets to the end of this little collection of things that we should clothe ourselves with. And in verse 14, he says, and over all these things, put on love that binds it all together in perfect unity. You see, Paul has this preoccupation with love and gives an entire chapter in the letter to the Corinthians, right? Love is patient, love is kind, love is da-da-da-da-da. You've heard it at a wedding, I'm sure. Love, as Paul says here, covers it all. Love binds it all together. Even the guy who hung out with Jesus the closest and who experienced the overwhelming grace of Jesus after he had denied him 3 times, and they meet back up and he doesn't get shamed by Jesus, but instead he's forgiven by Jesus. Jesus goes to Peter and says, hey, you're forgiven, bro. Whatever you said, whatever you did, I love you. So now love. Tend my sheep, feed my lambs. That guy, in one of his letters, in 1 Peter, he is known to say that love, this thing Paul's talking about, covers a multitude of sins. That when you look at the sins of the people around you, if you could just divert or revert to love. It makes it easier. If you forget the list of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, maybe you can at least remember love. So what did the preacher say I'm supposed to clothe myself with? If you can't remember anything else, just put on love. Just put on love. And the truth is, most of these things are in the definition of love anyway. Just put on love. Because it covers all. It pulls the whole outfit together. But here's our problem and our opportunity. It seems that Christians are oftentimes better known, not for what they wear, but for what they're against, for how they vote. They know us as being people who say one thing and do another, who say we have Jesus in our life, so that got us to heaven, but we have not allowed heaven to get into us. And we live as saved people who have it all together until people watch us living and they realize what we say and what we do don't seem to be the same all the time. And so when we find ourselves living in a way that's not consistent with the way of Jesus, we just start talking about the way of Jesus again, hoping to convince people with our words. But what I've learned is that oftentimes our actions are so loud, people can't hear a word that we're saying. So what if we could reveal to the world? What if we could be so aware of the domino that we hold, that we're trying to tip, that we remind ourselves it's really as simple as just clothing ourselves. Clothing ourselves, letting people see the thing that's on us. And that being the thing of Jesus. There's There's a story that many of you have probably heard before. It came to mind this week. It's an old fable. It was written in the 1830s. It was written by a guy named Hans Christian Andersen, and the title of the folk fairy tale was The Emperor's New Clothes. You ever heard of this story? Yeah, so you probably know it better than I know it. But here's, for those who haven't heard the story, here's the story in my way of summarizing it for the sake of time. Those of you who know the story, you may even know where this whole thing is going. I don't know why the Lord gave this story to me as I was preparing, but he did. And this is the basic gist of the story. So there's this emperor who, kind of like me, likes clothes. Likes clothes more than anything else. That's not like me. I just go to Goodwill, whatever they got on the rack. But he loved clothes. He would skip out on meetings to go shopping, it says, was my rendition. He didn't care about really anything but looking great. And so what happens is these two guys come to town who are really good at making clothing, and they report that they make the best clothing, the finest clothing. And of course, this emperor is super geeked out about that. He's super excited, and oh boy, they got to make me something. I'm the emperor, so y'all come, let me set you up a place to do this work. So he sets them up a little place whatever they were working on. I don't know what sewing. They didn't have electric machines, but it was something else. They were weaving and such. The problem was that for those who were watching them work, they couldn't really see anything happening. Because here was the deal. These weavers said that the only people who could actually see the fabric being woven were people of high character. People who they had this special ability because they were righteous, they were good people. Only they could see what was actually being worked on. And if you walked over here and you saw them going to work and you didn't see anything, that said much more about who you are than about who they are. And so as they worked, they would collect funds and they would collect thread, this beautiful gold stuff, and they would just collect it, they'd just throw it in their bag. And then they would use it in the things they were making. Well, now the emperor heard about this, and so the emperor sent, in one version of the story, sends a minister, which is sort of condemning, but sends a minister of his flock over to take a look at it. Minister walks in, looks at what they're doing, and to himself is thinking, I don't see anything. I don't know what they're doing over there. It does not look like they're working at all. But remembering that if you were of high character, if you were living right, doing right, you would easily be able to see the fine material that was being worked on there in your presence. Pastor's not going to get caught up as being a person that's not high character. So minister sees it. Oh my gosh, it's beautiful. Absolutely stunning. Goes back to report such to the emperor. Oh my goodness, the work they're doing is incredible. Just wait till it's done. I can't wait to see you wearing it. It's going to be wonderful. The emperor goes for a second opinion, sends someone else, a wise man from his council, sends over, and again, the wise man goes, internally, I don't see anything, but it's so beautiful, though. I see nothing, but it's so beautiful, though. It's beautiful. Boy, emperor, you're going to love it. Until finally the emperor goes to find these two hard at work on his outfit that he cannot wait to throw on and to wear in the community. Again, he loves a good shirt, loves some nice draws. And he goes, they bring this thing to him, they pull out some big scissors, and they're cutting this fabric, and they're fitting him, and they're holding it up to him, and the emperor looks at it, and in his own mind, I don't see anything. There's nothing there. But again, out of his own pride and needing to protect his image, I'll buy in. Oh, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Here, let's try it on. Let's see if it fits. And so he puts on this outfit, and he decides to go out and show the world. And in sort of an 1800s Adam and Eve before the fall story, you got a naked emperor walking through the community. But everybody else has heard that if you can't see it, you're not good enough. If you've not seen it, you don't have great character. And so no one will admit that they don't see a thing. Because we all love the facade of having it all together. We all love the facade. But a child watches him walk down the street and says, he's naked. The word the Lord gave me this week, as it relates to this idea of clothing ourselves with kindness and gentleness and compassion and humility, love. It was as if God was trying to remind me, Brent, don't get in front of those people and pretend that you are wearing those clothes. That you always have those clothes on you. Don't you get up there and pretend in front of all those people that you always have it all together. And don't you let them walk out of church thinking they do either. Don't you let those people you love and care for walk out of here naked, thinking as if they're wearing love. Because a child will call you out. Our culture will call you out. You see, there's something about putting this thing on, but make sure you're really putting it on. Because the world is waiting to call you naked. They're just waiting to tell you that you're just fooling yourself. Your game it's not consistent with your words. It's a tough lesson. But if we want our dominoes to keep tipping, we better show they're tired of listening to us talk. The world is tired of listening to us talk. So how do we get there, and how do we encourage each other along the way? Well, there was a subtle little piece here at the end of this section that Pam and I actually talked about in the office. We thought, man, that's interesting. I never really thought about it that way. At the very end of this little section, in verse 16, Paul says, "Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly, as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit." The songs that we sing are not just songs of worship and praise to the Father. They are songs to be sung over one another, to remind one another what we believe, to remind one another what God has called us to as a community of people. It's interesting, if we look at the last song of this morning, when we start singing that song, I just wanted to invite you and encourage you. As you sing that song, I want you to imagine that the words you're singing are admonishing, encouraging the people around you in their walk with the Lord. You're cheering each other on as you sing. You're reminding the people around you of God's goodness, and reminding the people around you of what God's calling us to do and the way we live our lives. It's like these songs are the invitation to step into a dressing room and, hey, this would look great on you. That's what these words seem to say to me, and I had this opportunity to live that out last weekend. I was at a celebration of life for an old high school friend of mine. He was my tennis partner, my doubles partner in high school, and he was my first college roommate, and he passed away several weeks ago, and so we went to Beaumont to celebrate his life, and we were in there singing some songs together in worship. And 3 rows in front of me was another mutual friend, and that friend of mine, I haven't seen since really graduation, but that friend of mine's battling cancer for the second or third time now, and life's not easy for him at all. Life's been really hard for him. And I found myself, as we were singing in this celebration of life for my friend who's now deceased, that my mind went completely away from him, from that man who no longer had breath in his lungs, but to the man who was 3 rows up. And I found myself singing as loud as I could so that he would hear. I wanted him to hear that someone believed what we were all singing. I wanted him to believe that God had not left him, that God had not forsaken him, and even when he doesn't see it, God's working, and even when he doesn't feel it, God's working, and I wanted to sing it so loud in his ears that the singing became less about my worship of God and my own need for God to show up for me, and more about an admonition and an encouragement and a lesson I wanted my friend to hear. Because in that moment, my heart wanted that friend to know the love of the Father. I wonder if we can practice that when we sing our last song. Be more than just a rehearsal for the time we get to sing in the presence of God face to face, but it's an opportunity to encourage the people around us. This is good stuff in here. This is a good word from the Lord. It's been good for me. It was helpful for me this week. I hope that somehow my transmission of it to you will find itself useful for you. Let me pray, and then we'll move forward in that last song. God, you are really good. And this week I was just really reminded of how grateful I am that Paul wrote these letters. Grateful that when the early church was trying to come together and trying to figure out why they exist, trying to figure out the best way to get the good news of Jesus into the hands and the hearts of the people around them, that you showed up through Paul in a very special way. Your Holy Spirit was revealed through his lips and through his pen as you encouraged those early believers. God, the truth is that your believers in 2022 need the same encouragement. We need to be reminded, God, what a life clothed in you would look like. When we wake up in the morning, we think about what we're going to wear each day that may be equal to what pants or shirt or socks or shoes we might put on our bodies, that we might find ourselves, our minds being pulled back to the 3rd chapter of Colossians, where you said, more importantly, clothe yourselves with these things. As chosen people, as holy people, as loved people, preoccupy yourself with how you're getting dressed in the spiritual realm. Put on compassion. Put on gentleness. Put on patience and kindness, and put on the things that are the fruit of my spirit in you. Wear it so that when you bump into people, they won't say nice shirt. They'll say nice love. Hey, nice shoes. Instead, they might say, thank you for loving me. I know I was pretty unlovable in that conversation, but thank you for loving me anyway. I know we don't agree on all things, but thank you for loving me anyway. I know I may have disappointed you and fallen short of the goals you had for me, Mom or Dad, but thank you for loving me. God, help us to clothe ourselves in you. We need your help, so we ask for it in Jesus' name. Amen.